several days, and he said, Lyndon wants this thing as quickly as possible. It doesn't mean anything anyway. I wouldn't be sponsoring it if I thought it meant any change in policy. It's purely a matter of handling the situation politically to indicate that the Congress stands behind the president. This is a bipartisan effort. And that's the way Bill Fulbright saw it. And with some reservations, Gaylord and I agreed to go along without offering an amendment or raising any complaint about it. I regret that very much.
Fulbright delivered for the president. 2 days after the reported attacks, Congress overwhelmingly approved the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. But Fulbright's trust in his friend was soon shaken. In late April 1965, the United States' attention turned from the jungles of Vietnam to the beaches of the Caribbean, as news came of a revolutionary uprising in the Dominican Republic. On April 28th, President Johnson announced that United States Marines had arrived in the Caribbean, quote, in order to give protection to hundreds of Americans who are still in the Dominican Republic and to escort them safely back to this country. But within days, the administration radically changed its justification for the incursion.
The American nation cannot, must not, and will not permit the establishment of another communist government in the Western Hemisphere.
And I remember myself looking off outside in Santo Domingo and seeing the weight of the might of the United States Navy weighed anchor. And the record was that Johnson was talking, there were thousands of communists and they were beheading people and they stuck people's heads on poles. None of it was true. It wasn't true. It was hyperbole. And Fulbright saw out of this backdrop a kind of reach that the president was making that he thought was dangerous and not truthful.
Fulbright was angry and confused, and he had nowhere to turn. His aides counseled the senator to avoid an open brawl with the president that could crush Fulbright politically. Fulbright prepared a speech in which he would, for the first time, openly, directly criticize Johnson. His aides split on whether the speech should be delivered.
Lee Williams and Carl Marcy were the principal opponents of the senator going public with this statement on the Dominican Republic. I remember at one point, Carl said, well, Senator, this is going to get you in a lot of trouble in Arkansas. And Senator said, well, I didn't ask your advice on Arkansas. I'm the politician. I'll worry about that. I want to know what your view is on the substance of this statement. Carl said the substance of it is sound and accurate. He said, well, that's what I want to know.
I thought I knew a little about Lyndon Johnson. I thought I knew his character and what Senator Fulbright criticizing him publicly would do to his ego. So I took the view that Senator Fulbright should never make such a speech, that there were other ways to handle it one-on-one, certainly not to do it publicly.
And I remember Lee Williams, who was the AA from Arkansas, he thought it was a very bad thing to do, was to make an open break with Johnson. I don't know, it may have been. History will have to determine that. But personally, I thought it was my duty. If I saw it differently, it was my duty as chairman of the committee to say so, whether they were right or wrong. I expect I made a number of mistakes on that basis, but I still think that's the duty of any chairman. He has to call it the way he sees it, and if he's wrong, he's just wrong. That's all there is to it.
The speed and severity of the administration's response to his speech shocked Fulbright.
President Johnson told his staff, bring the curtain down. Don't give Fulbright's office anything.
Well, it changed the whole nature of your dealings with the executive branch of the government, where previously they had been very cooperative and collaborative, and you could pretty much get the information or that you wanted. They became very suspicious of you and very hostile.
The fallout from the speech took an inevitable toll on the personal relationship between Fulbright and Johnson. In October, Fulbright wrote Johnson a courteous letter explaining that his speech was intended to help you in your relations with the countries of Latin America. Johnson never replied.
And I still think if he'd been a reasonable man at all, he wouldn't have taken it that seriously, and we could have had a conversation about it and talked about it. But that was one thing he was very arrogant about. Friends were friends regardless. Well, I never did look at politics that way. Politics seemed to me was separate, different from just personal friendship. I never thought about in the same way that he did.
At the height of the Dominican Republic crisis, Betty Fulbright, Bill's partner of nearly 2 decades, suffered a heart attack. She recovered, but her health was a constant concern for the rest of their time together. The senator was now severely challenged by the trouble brewing on both political and home fronts. The greatest tests, however, lay ahead. In January 1966, William Fulbright led the Senate Foreign Relations Committee in televised hearings on the war in Vietnam, questioning members of the executive branch, military officials, and historians. The hearings sought to provide an understanding of American policy in Southeast Asia.
The Senate Foreign Relations Committee became the focal point for dissent. There was enormous dissatisfaction in America with American foreign policy in Vietnam as expressed in the White House, President Johnson and his top advisors. There was no place for the American people who disagreed with that policy to go, except to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee.
This was being debated every place in the country, on every campus in the country, with violence many times. It was debated between the parties and within the parties. Why shouldn't the Congress of the United States, the Senate of the United States, hold such hearings to bring the truth out, to have it publicly done?
Both Secretary of State Dean Rusk and Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara testified before the committee to explain the administration's position on the war. Rusk's inability to make a strong case for military involvement in Vietnam increased the credibility of Fulbright's purpose. During McNamara's testimony regarding inaccuracies put forth about the Gulf of Tonkin attacks, sparks flew between Fulbright and the Defense Secretary.
The Secretary has not seen fit to declassify information relating to sonar on the Maddox. He has kept secret important communications from the task force that indicated doubt about the reported attack on August the 4th, but released communications that served his purpose. He refers...
Well, the hearings, I think, were indispensable to a better understanding, to airing points of view. I frankly don't understand why anyone would criticize hearings of any nature unless, like the McCarthy hearings, they were persecuting individuals. But the hearings that he conducted were very much concerned with policy, with procedures, with history. And the more proceedings of that sort, the better. One of the great and beneficial powers of Congress lies in its investigating powers, and that should never be tampered with.
You don't cut off free speech in this country. If there are people who object to a policy, they have a right to state that objection, and they did that in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And they did it very strongly and forcefully. Did it cause problems for the Johnson administration? Well, of course it did. It made it more difficult to execute the war. But the fact is that those people turned out to be right, and the president turned out to be wrong.
Lyndon Johnson and his administration did not take the debate over his foreign policy lightly. For all practical purposes, Fulbright's initiation of the hearings on Vietnam put an end to his long friendship with Johnson. The president's anger toward Fulbright was absolute. He often lashed out at the senator in telephone conversations with members of his administration.
All these career people, and I got this damn fool Fulbright that fights me on everything. He wants foreign relations, and he's siding in with Chu and Lao and the Russians this morning on wanting me to stop bombing out there. He doesn't want them to stop bombing Americans and killing people.
You're the president. You make the policy.
And he doesn't want them to stop killing secretaries in the American embassy, but he wants us to stop knocking out bridges. I don't understand. But anyway.
Johnson privately warned Senator Robert F. Kennedy that he would politically destroy you, Fulbright, Church, and every one of your Dove friends in 6 months.
It takes a lot of courage for a member of the United States Senate to challenge a president or the president if he's in your own political party.
Fulbright was not some radical that, thought he was advancing his own career and wanted to be in the headlines by showing he could stand up to his party's president. He liked and admired Lyndon Johnson. He supported him. He believed in him. He thought that, for all kinds of reasons, he had driven into a blind alley in Vietnam and he couldn't turn around and get out.
The truth is that those hearings conducted by Senator Fulbright were as patriotic as anything he ever did in his life, because he genuinely believed, as I did, that the war in Vietnam was undermining the best interests of America, undermining our values, undermining what we stood for in world affairs, undermining what we were as a people, undermining our Constitution. And not to confront that, if those were your beliefs, would have been virtually an act of treason. So I think that Senator Fulbright should have been hailed as a great patriot when he had the courage to conduct well-organized hearings questioning our continued involvement in a war that was not serving the interests of the United States.
In numerous speeches and public appearances, Fulbright termed America's ill-advised foreign policy as the arrogance of power. In January of 1967, he published a book by that title. Gradually, but unmistakably, he wrote, America is showing signs of that arrogance of power which has afflicted, weakened, and in some cases destroyed great nations in the past. In doing so, we are not living up to our promise and capacity as a civilized example for the world. The measure of our falling short is the measure of the patriot's duty of dissent.
Certainly the President and Secretary of State felt that way strongly, that it was hurting the war in Vietnam to have hearings and to have the opposition that Fulbright did. I think that was probably right. It certainly didn't help any, and it must have been some encouragement to North Vietnam to see that kind of dissent in the United States.
The CIA would quite often show up in the chairman's office in the morning and show how Pravda, Izvestia, or Radio Moscow had carried whatever he had said the day before, and with the implication that he was sort of helping the enemy. He didn't believe in that. He believed that, like everybody else, this was propaganda on their side, and he didn't care what they used his words for. What he cared about were Americans were being in a position where they could decide, with knowledge on both sides, which way they wanted to go on any foreign policy controversy, and certainly Vietnam was the toughest.
We will have our differences and our disputes, and we will do it without questioning the integrity.
As the confrontation between Fulbright and Johnson heated up, the two adversaries each sought to gain public support. The nation's media served as the battleground on which each man advanced his position.
We will never surrender this world to those who want to dominate it and to those who want to destroy it.
The Sunday talk shows on the networks were constantly calling Meet the Press and Face the Nation. Issues and Answers were the big three programs at that time. He was one of the most frequent guests on those programs, and they were constantly trying to arrange for him to appear. Also, the international, we were always getting calls from the Japanese or the European TV networks or European newspapers or magazines, the wire services, It was constant. It was exciting and it was something that we thought was very important, and so you were willing to always try to do everything you possibly could. But at times it was also a bit exhausting, certainly for Senator Fulbright as well as the staff.
If any country could ever afford to withdraw, we'll say, or to mediate or conciliate, be conciliating in this case, we can. Nobody's going to think we're a paper tiger because we make a settlement here.
While Fulbright's criticism enraged Johnson, the president was careful not to have his bitterness at the Arkansan construed as a personal vendetta. He wrote to Fulbright, "I cannot believe our differences over policy have erased the friendship we have shared for so long. I have a fondness for you and Betty that is real. I am sorry that careless people have appeared to paint another picture."
Vietnam was a constant frustration to President Johnson because what he was interested in was the Great Society. He was interested, as he did in his typical, I'll say Texas fashion, but it was grandiose. We're going to eliminate poverty. We're going to eliminate sickness. We're going to eliminate crime. That kind of approach, and that was what interested him. And here he was all bogged down, and his time was taken on Vietnam, which was a mess, and he didn't really know what to do about it. None of us did.
Johnson's distress only grew as he saw public support continue to fall away. On March 31st, 1968, President Lyndon Johnson went before a national television audience and shocked the world.
I shall not seek, and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president.
Johnson never tried to reconcile with Fulbright. In just 5 years, this larger-than-life figure, whose career had so influenced that of William Fulbright, would be dead. Following Richard Nixon's election in 1968, Fulbright faced a president from the opposing party. He hoped Nixon would move forward with his campaign pledge to take the United States out of Southeast Asia. Fulbright waited until it was revealed that the president was sending American troops into Cambodia. Not only was Nixon expanding the scope of the war, he was doing so in secret. Fulbright was outraged at the executive branch's overreaching its authority, secretly sending troops into another country and further risking American lives. The administration's continued escalation of bombing in Southeast Asia swayed many other legislators toward Fulbright's position. Despite Nixon's re-election, by 1973 the Congress and the country had had enough. In a series of votes, Congress took action to withhold funding for the war and to rein in executive power in the use of the military. Nixon was forced to cease hostilities.
At 12:30 Paris time today, January 23, 1973, the agreement on ending the war and restoring peace in Vietnam was initialed by Dr. Henry Kissinger on behalf of the United States and Special Advisor Lee Duc-Tho on behalf of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam.
American troops were finally withdrawn from Vietnam. But for Fulbright, the end came 7 years too late and at too high a cost for the United States. More than 50,000 American lives. Following his conscience on the war in Vietnam had served the nation well, but soon it proved costly to Fulbright's political career. In 1974, J. William Fulbright asked the voters of Arkansas to return him to the United States Senate for a 6th term. Unlike previous campaigns, this time Fulbright found himself a decided underdog against the state's popular governor, Dale Bumpers.
I thought he was a wonderful senator. I thought the state was lucky to have a man like him in the Senate representing us, and not just the state, but the entire nation.
He campaigned hard right up until the last minute. He didn't let up. He worked hard. He did everything he could. He gave it his best effort. but it wasn't enough in that case.
It was almost unbearable to the thought that here this man who had contributed so much to the nation had been defeated by his own people when he was spent 30 years taking care of their business and taking care of it very well.
But the thing I admire him the most about, that it was a late night and everybody was upset, but the Today Show called him and wanted him to appear on the Today Show the next morning, and I thought, that's pretty tough. But do you know, he did. And he said that, I think it was where he really felt, he said, that's what this system is all about. We trot our names out every 4 years, and the people either vote you in or vote you out. And he said, and I got voted out.
Retired from politics, Fulbright led a largely private life. President Gerald Ford did offer him the ambassadorship to Britain, but despite happy memories of his Oxford days, Fulbright respectfully turned down the post. He was weary of public life, and Betty was in poor health. For many years, Betty was seriously ill. By the 1980s, she was an invalid who needed constant care. In October of 1985, she died, leaving Bill Fulbright without his vibrant partner and best friend of more than 50 years. Now alone, Bill Fulbright continued work on what he considered his greatest achievement, the Fulbright Scholarship Program. In his capacity as honorary chairman of the program, Fulbright met Harriet Mayer. Harriet's intellect, vast knowledge of the world, and boundless energy appealed to Fulbright. A mutual affection developed, ultimately prompting the senator to propose. In 1990, the two married and spent the next few years traveling the world, celebrating the many successes of the Fulbright program, life-changing for its participants. The awards, accolades, and honorary degrees from international institutions were unprecedented for an American statesman. Among many honors, Fulbright was tapped by the Royal Society of the Arts in London, awarded the prestigious Order of the Rising Sun by the Japanese government, and presented with the Aristotle Onassis Award in Athens.
He was treated not just as a senior elder statesman, he was a superhero because he had literally transformed hundreds of thousands of lives. That Fulbright program, when a person went onto it, expanded the whole horizon, expanded one's network, changed one's career. And so people just looked at him in wonderment and awe because of the effect that he had.
It feels fantastic to be described as a Fulbrighter. Every time I hear it, I get a little smile on my face because it started everything. I mean, before that, yes, I had in school, I was, a good student and I'd gotten all these awards and stuff, but the Fulbright was it was the hinge. It was the hinge that opened up, as I said before, it opened up the world to me. So every time I hear Fulbright, I think, that's when this larger life began.
I believe because of the program, I became more of an internationalist. And that's been serving me well. Again, I come back to globalization. I come back to the global village. I come back to the fact that we're all in the same strategic boat because everything has shrunk.
For me to have a grant, in Fulbright grant, was really an honor and an opportunity to come here to see and to research about this one. You don't imagine the emotion that I feel.
In Fulbright's lifetime, nearly 250,000 recipients of Fulbright scholarships from across the globe left their homes to study in other nations. President Kennedy once called the Fulbright program the classic example of beating swords into plowshares. Fulbright's contribution to halting the Cold War was subtle, something Fulbright never chose to quantify. Fortunately, he lived long enough to see the symbolic end of the struggle between East and West as the Berlin Wall came tumbling down in 1989.
One evening we were watching the Berlin Wall coming down, and the music was incredible, and the excitement amongst the young was simply amazing. And he looked and he said, "Good heavens." He said, "You know, this is the first time that I'm sorry that I'm not going to be here for very much longer, because with this happening, things are really going to get interesting."
On May 5, 1993, President Bill Clinton awarded Fulbright the Presidential Medal of Freedom at a dinner for the Fulbright Scholarship Program. In the late 60s, a young Clinton had interned on Fulbright's staff, and the two had stayed close throughout their careers. 2 years after receiving this high honor, in January 1995, Fulbright suffered a stroke that left him paralyzed. 3 weeks later, at age 89, J. William Fulbright died at his home in Washington.
We've gathered this day for in the life of William Fulbright, his vision and his courage, his contribution to the building of community, his companionship